Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I have been away on a little 2-week summer vacation, but I am back and here with a Nikon tutorial. Today, we're talking about the Nikon Zfc. I love this camera. It's got this really cool retro film camera-esque body, and I love the manual control dials at the top. It's relatively lightweight, relatively inexpensive for a mirrorless camera, and it packs the same 21 megapixel APS-C sensor as the incredible D500 DSLR. Lately, I've read a lot of questions about this camera, specifically about the autofocus system and whether or not it can be used for bird photography. If you're curious about that, well, today you're in luck because I have used this camera for bird photography myself. And in fact, in today's video, I want to answer this question specifically and show you how I set my ZFC up for bird photography. Just to be clear though, this isn't going to be a full camera tutorial or review, and I'm also not going to compare this camera to any other cameras. I'm just going to talk through how I use the ZFC. Although, if you're curious, I think the D500 is a better value and a better camera, as long as you don't mind using F-mount glass. If you're into mirrorless, the Z50 is also cheaper and is 99% the same camera as the ZFC. But you didn't hear it from me. I'm also going to keep some of my explanations pretty high level, but if there's anything you'd like to see a deeper dive into, just leave me a comment below and I can add it to my video ideas list. Anyways, first things first, we need to go through some menu settings to configure this camera with the autofocus settings that we need. Let's get started. Okay, let's dive into the menu settings. I'm going to start in the custom settings menu under section A for autofocus. I don't customize every option on this menu, but I'll talk through the ones that I think are personally important to me for my bird photography. First up, we have A1, which is AFC priority selection. To understand this setting, we need to quickly talk about focus modes. The camera's focus mode determines its behavior when the autofocus button is pressed. For today's video, we'll compare two focus modes, AFC and AFS. Personally, I always use AFC for bird photography. And if you don't know what it is, AFC stands for autofocus continuous. And to explain it simply, while in this mode, anytime you are pressing the autofocus button, the camera will continuously scan for a subject and continuously adjust focus in response to changes in the distance to the subject. AFS, which stands for autofocus single on the other hand, will find your subject, focus on it, and then stop, even if you continue holding down the button. To focus again, you have to release your autofocus button and press it again. Birds are moving around constantly, and I want my camera to be constantly refocusing with them, so I opt for AFC. And that brings us to this menu option. AFC priority selection deals with how autofocus continuous handles autofocus priority. The setting I choose is release. And what this mode, which is called release priority, means, in short, is that I can press the shutter and take a photo even if the camera doesn't detect that the subject is in focus. The other mode, focus priority, will only allow a shot when the camera detects that the subject is in focus. I've tried this mode before, but I've missed shots because of it. I could see that my subject was in focus, but the camera wasn't able to confirm it, and so it would not take the shot. In my opinion, it's better to take a shot and it be out of focus than to not be even allowed to take a shot that could potentially be in focus. So I opt for release priority mode. Okay, so next up we've got option A2, which has to do with autofocus single. Again, I never use AFS for autofocus with birds, so I skip this one. Okay, so then let's jump down to setting A3, which is focus tracking with lock on. This one's a little more tricky to explain, but in essence, this setting determines how quickly the camera will jump to a new subject when it detects one. For example, suppose you're panning and tracking a bird in flight, and it flies behind a tree, but only briefly. You might not want the camera to lose sight of the bird and then suddenly shift focus to the trees. Or suppose, like with this shot, that you're panning while on shaky ground and you don't want a sudden movement or a jolt to cause the camera to focus on the background. Oh, and by the way, we'll see why that can be especially problematic with this camera in just a moment. If you're worried about either of these things, set your slider closer to the delayed side. The camera will hold on to focus longer before switching. On the other hand, you may have a tiny bird jumping in and out of branches, and you may wish to have the camera quickly track new subjects. If that's the case, you may want to set the slider closer to the quick side. Personally, I normally set this to 4 unless the situation warrants something different. Okay, let's move on to setting A4, focus points used. This one definitely confused me at first, and I wasn't really sure what it meant, so if you're like me and misunderstanding what this setting is for, hopefully this will help. Essentially, if you're using a single point focus mode and you are manually selecting the focus point, this setting makes it so that you essentially skip every other focus point when you arrow over to the one you want. This doesn't affect what autofocus points the camera uses in auto area autofocus. The entire purpose is just to save you a little bit of time by essentially halving the number of button clicks that you have to do to get to a certain destination. I go back and forth on whether I prefer to save time or to have extra granularity in my selection points, but currently I do have this one switched off. Alright, let's jump on down to setting A6. I do change this setting, and this one is huge. This option is what allows you to use back button autofocus. For those of you not in the know, I'm about to change your bird photography life. You see, by default, autofocus is engaged by half pressing the shutter button on this camera. And this is fine for casual shooting, but for birds, I want more control over when autofocus is engaged. For example, if I have focus locked in, I don't want to accidentally engage the autofocus as I'm taking a shot and risk losing or changing focus at the last second. The opposite is also true. If I have a subject that is relatively still and it starts suddenly moving, as birds often do, I want to quickly re-engage the autofocus in a split second. This option disables the ability to engage autofocus with a half-press shutter button, and it moves it to the back of the camera to the AF on button. This gives you the full flexibility to use continuous autofocus when you need to, without the risk of losing or changing focus when you don't want to. It even means that you can grab your lens and use manual focus without changing any camera settings, if you need to. The next setting I want to talk about is actually down in section F, custom controls. I set the custom function button on the front of this camera to the focus mode, AF area mode option, and that way I can quickly switch autofocus area modes while I'm out in the field. And actually, one more thing that I want to explain at this point is what an autofocus area mode is. I'm not talking about the focus modes like continuous or single that I mentioned before. Those determine how the camera focuses. An autofocus area mode determines where the camera focuses. Let's start with single point. In single point mode, the camera focuses on a point that's selected by the user. This mode is primarily meant for stationary subjects, and I typically won't use it for bird photography. There are variations of this mode called wide area that work the same way but with bigger focus boxes, but I tend not to use them for bird photography. I often find with this camera, they just don't do a great job with finding and focusing on birds. Next up, we've got dynamic area mode. It's like single point in that the camera focuses on a point selected by the user. This mode is better for active subjects than single point though, because if the subject briefly leaves the selected point, the camera is going to focus based on information from these surrounding focus points. In my experience, I've found that as long as the subject doesn't stray too far from these dots around the box, it'll stay in focus. And this makes it better for birds. 90% of the time with the ZFC, I have the camera set to dynamic area mode with the focus point on the center of the frame. This is problematic for a subject that's moving around too quickly, but it's great for larger birds, relatively stationary birds, and for small birds that are popping in and out of branches. For the remaining 10% of my time, and this would mainly be for really fast moving birds and birds in flight, I will use auto area autofocus, which scans the entire screen and it focuses on the subject that it detects. This mode comes with problems for birds though, in that the camera will typically only focus on the closest subject. The camera may also be unable to find the bird if it lacks contrast, if there's sharply contrasting brightness, if the subject's too small in the frame, and even according to the manual, if the subject is moving. And by the way, the camera does come with two alternate auto area autofocus modes, one for people and one for animals. You might think that for birds you would want to select the animals feature, but I wouldn't even bother. It is only supported according to the manual for cats and dogs. Okay, let's jump back into the menu settings for a second. I want to talk about an option that I glossed over earlier so that I could define auto area focus modes first. But if we go back into the custom settings menu and look at option A7, I just wanted to point out that this option does allow you to disable all of the auto area modes that you don't plan to use. This option is really helpful if you just wanted to say, for example, only enable dynamic area and auto area and disable all the rest so that you only have 2 different area modes to switch between, just to save you time in the heat of the moment. Okay, so we've talked through the menu settings that I use, and I've given a high-level explanation of the key autofocus modes that I prefer. Now, let's put it all together. When I go out in the field, the first thing I do is switch my ZFC to manual mode, and I also turn on auto ISO. I typically start my aperture at wide open, but I may stop the lens down as needed. I also typically start my shutter speed at around 1/1250th of a second, and I'll speed it up or slow it down depending on the light and how fast I think my subject will be. This minimizes the amount of decision making that I'm going to do so that I can focus. Get it? Focus. So that I can concentrate on getting the bird in focus. I'll start with the camera in dynamic area autofocus with the focus point centered, and as I see birds, I'll use that back button autofocus to acquire focus and just recompose the shot. If the bird's in flight, I'll do my best to keep the bird centered on the focus point with the continuous autofocus engaged while I'm busy taking shots. Also, as needed, I may switch over to auto area mode, especially if the action is too fast for me to keep up with. And I'll do that by using the custom button that we set earlier in the video. Simply hold the button down and use the front and back dials to select your preferred focus mode. I've found that this technique with the ZFC has worked really well for me personally. If you've got one that works for you too, I'd love to hear it down in the comments. Maybe there's something better out there that I haven't tried yet. At the end of the day, the ZFC is a good camera and I always have fun when I'm shooting it. If I really think about it, there are only 2 setbacks that I can think of when it comes to the autofocus specifically and this camera. The first, it's not actually directly related to autofocus. It has to do with shutter blackout. In fact, I did a whole nother video a while back where I compared the autofocus between this camera, the Z6 II, and the Z9, and I found in that video that the ability to acquire focus and stick to the subject between the 3 cameras really wasn't incredibly far off, at least in my test scenarios. At least in those test cases, the real difference maker that I felt was actually the Z9's lack of a shutter blackout. Go check out that video if you want to see more, but in short, the ZFC's continuous shutter blackout just makes it hard to stay dialed in and focused on a bird, especially in flight. The second setback that I feel with this camera is actually not unique to this camera alone, but it does happen a lot with the ZFC and it drives me crazy. It's when the focus jumps to the background and then the autofocus system just cannot seem to find the subject in the foreground anymore. In fact, this is so bad that I'll typically have my hand on the lens and ready to assist the camera. Once I dial it back and get it kind of close, the autofocus can pick the subject back up again, but I can't tell you how many shots that I've missed of birds, especially in flight, because of it just jumping to the background and never being able to recover. Alright, well that about covers everything for today's video. Let me know what questions you have down in the comments below. Next week, I'll be doing a very similar video, but for the Nikon Z6 II, so please stay tuned for that. And finally, I am so close to 1,000 subscribers, at least at the time of recording this. So hey, if you're finding value in this content and you want to see more, please consider a subscribe, and I wouldn't mind a like either. Thank you, and hey, I'll see you next week.